August 19th, 1944. The Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. Inside Adolf Hitler's concrete bunker, General Oberst Alfred Jodl is looking at a map of France. He is smiling. The German Western Front is collapsing, but Jodl believes he has found the fatal flaw in the American advance. He looks at the distance between the Normandy beaches and General Patton's tanks. It is 400 miles. Jodl does the math.
He knows that a single armored division burns 150,000 gallons of fuel a day. He knows that supply lines stretch until they snap. The Americans have outrun their logistics, Jodl tells his staff confidently. Patton will halt within hours. Physics is on our side. He was convinced the Americans would stop at the Seine River, giving the Wehrmacht time to regroup for winter. It was a logical, mathematically perfect calculation, and it was completely wrong. What Jodl didn't know
was that 125 miles away, an engine was starting, then another, then 6,000 more. At that very moment, 5,958 trucks were rolling eastward. They were driving bumper to bumper. They were driving at high speed. And in a shocking defiance of military doctrine, they were driving at night with their headlights blazing. This was the Red Ball Express. It was a logistical operation so insane, so massive, that the German military mind couldn't even conceive of it.
Within 72 hours, Patton wouldn't stop. He would crash through the Seine. Within a week, Paris would be free. The masters of the Blitzkrieg were about to be taught a brutal lesson by 23,000 truck drivers, most of them African Americans, who turned a highway into a weapon. The German confidence wasn't just arrogance, it was based on experience. They remembered Russia. In 1941, the Wehrmacht had raced across the Soviet Union until they ran out of gas.
Their trucks broke down in the mud. Their supply lines snapped. They learned the hard way that a tank without fuel is just a steel bunker. Crucially, the German army was still moving at the speed of a horse. 80% of their supplies were carried by wagons. They assumed the Americans faced the same limits. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, a panzer commander, wrote a report that sounded more like a physics paper than a battle plan.
The Americans faced the same impossibility we faced in Russia, Luttwitz wrote. They have advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History teaches us what comes next. Paralysis. German intelligence knew the numbers. A Sherman tank gets half a mile to the gallon. General Patton had 12 divisions. They needed 12,000 tons of supplies every single day just to survive. General Major Siegfried Westphal, the Chief of Staff in the West, did the calculation on August 20th.
He concluded that even if the Americans had unlimited trucks, which he doubted, they couldn't physically move that much material over damaged roads. Physical laws cannot be violated, Westphal said, not even by American industry. He was convinced Patton would run dry in 48 hours. But Westphal made one fatal mistake. He was calculating based on German limitations. He didn't know that the Americans were about to tear up the rulebook.
While the Germans were doing the math of defeat, the Americans were rewriting the rules.
August 25th, 1944. Inside a requisitioned French chateau, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and desperation. Lieutenant Colonel Lurin A. Ayres of the Motor Transport Service stood before a room of skeptical commanders. He told them the hard truth. Patton was moving too fast. The railway system was destroyed. The traditional supply lines had collapsed. So Ayres proposed a solution that sounded insane.
"Gentlemen," he said, "we are going to create a one-way highway from the port of Cherbourg straight to the front line." The plan violated every safety regulation in the book. 2 parallel roads would be seized from the French. One road strictly for trucks going east, loaded with ammo. The other road strictly for trucks coming west, empty. No civilian traffic. No stopping. Trucks would run 20 hours a day. The remaining 4 hours were for maintenance.
They would drive at night, not in blackout conditions, but with headlights blazing. They named it the Red Ball Express. It was an old railroad term. In the stations back home, a train car marked with a red dot meant priority cargo. It meant get out of the way. Colonel Charles Thrasher, the commander of AIDSEC, looked at the requirements. They needed 140 truck companies. They needed 6,000 vehicles immediately. It was logistically impossible. But the U.S. Army didn't care about impossible. They cared about winning. Within 36 hours, the engines started. On August 26, 1944, the engines roared to life. The vehicle was the GMC CCKW, the Deuce and a Half, a 6-wheel workhorse that would become the legs of the Allied Army. The men behind the wheel were the real story. If the Nazi racial theorists had seen who was driving, their heads would have exploded. Of the 23,000 drivers on the Red Ball Express, 75% were African Americans. It was a bitter irony. These men served in a segregated army. Back home, they couldn't eat in the same restaurants or use the same bathrooms as white civilians. Yet here, in France, they were the only thing keeping General Patton's White Army alive. They developed a fearless culture instantly. They painted slogans on their bumpers: Patton's Blood Bank, Detroit to Berlin Express, Hitler, here we come. And they drove like maniacs. Speed limit signs were ignored. If you drove under 25 miles per hour, you were a target. By August 28th, the Germans realized something was wrong. German reconnaissance units hiding in the hills radioed back impossible reports. They saw a continuous river of light. Headlights visible for 20 kilometers, the report said. No blackout discipline, 1,000 vehicles per hour.
General Lieutenant Edgar Fauchington, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, went to see it for himself. He watched from a concealed position and stared at the endless convoy passing every 30 seconds. He sent a terrifying message to Army Group B. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. They don't hide, they don't stop. This isn't military science. It is mass production applied to warfare.
The Germans were baffled because they were playing a different game. German doctrine was about precision, conservation, and stealth. You hide your trucks, you save your fuel, you follow the plan. The American doctrine was blunt force. They didn't care about stealth, they relied on overwhelming volume. They didn't conserve vehicles, they assumed 20% of them would break down, and just bought more. While the Germans followed rigid procedures, the Americans improvised every mile of the way.
When German intelligence intercepted the American logistics reports from the first week, they laughed. They tossed the papers aside, convinced it was fake radio traffic designed to fool them. They read the numbers: 90,000 tons delivered in 6 days, a daily average of 12,000 tons. Convoys making a nearly 700-mile round trip without stopping. Impossible, the German specialists said. Propaganda. But it was real. By September 5th, the Red Ball had found its rhythm.
It was a rhythm that the horse-drawn German army couldn't comprehend. A convoy departed the beach depots every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day. Each truck was overloaded, carrying 7 tons instead of the rated 5. They drove 350 miles east, dumped their cargo in 2 hours, and turned around immediately. At any given second of the day, there were 5,000 trucks moving on that highway. It wasn't a road anymore. It was a conveyor belt.
The highway was a mechanical slaughterhouse. Every single day, 1,800 trucks broke down. Tires exploded. Axles snapped. Engines melted from the heat. In the German army, a broken truck meant filling out forms and waiting days for parts. The Americans treated it like a pit stop. Mobile maintenance crews roamed the road like vultures. They had a brutal rule: fix it in 15 minutes or push it into a ditch. They cannibalized parts from dead trucks.
They used mobile cranes to swap out entire engines right on the roadside in 45 minutes flat. If a bridge was blown, they didn't wait for engineers. They filled the river with rubble and drove over it. To the German observers, it looked like total chaos, but it was chaos that worked. But the biggest mystery for the Nazis was the fuel. The Red Ball Express burned 300,000 gallons of gas a day just to run itself. It was burning fuel to move fuel. By all rights, they should have run dry. But the Americans had a secret weapon, invisible to the Luftwaffe. Operation Pluto. Pipelines under the ocean. While German spies were looking for tanker ships, British and American engineers had unspooled massive, flexible pipes across the floor of the English Channel. They were pumping gasoline from England directly into France. The Germans were trying to interdict ships.
They didn't know the enemy was drinking from a hose that ran under the sea. General Major Walter Warlimond sat in the German High Command, staring at aerial reconnaissance photos. He saw fuel dumps in open fields that were larger than the entire strategic reserve of the Third Reich. "This isn't war as we understand it," Warlimond muttered. "It is industrial overflow."
He realized the Americans were burning more gasoline just to move the gasoline than an entire panzer division used in combat. The result was speed. Impossible speed. German military textbooks stated that a tank division could advance 30 miles a day, maximum. Any faster and the tracks would break
or the fuel would run dry. But General Patton was doing 60 miles a day. On September 1st, the U.S. 4th Armored Division drove 35 miles before lunch. They stopped, fueled up from Red Ball trucks waiting on the roadside, and drove another 32 miles before dinner. In East Prussia, General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, read the reports and threw them down. "Impossible," he said. "No armored force can move that fast. It is propaganda." But then the German radio intercepts confirmed it. The Americans were moving so fast they didn't even bother to use code. They were broadcasting their positions openly over the radio.
They were telling the Germans exactly where they were, confident that the Wehrmacht was too slow to do anything about it. By September 5th, German intelligence realized the dark secret behind this speed. The American drivers weren't superhuman, they were high. They were operating on stimulants, benzodrine, driving for days without sleep, violating every rule of human endurance. When Field Marshal Walter Model read the intelligence reports, he didn't see a tactical problem. He saw the end of Germany.
"We face not a superior army," Model told his staff, "but a superior civilization." He realized the terrifying truth. The Americans didn't hide their trucks because they didn't fear the Luftwaffe. They wasted fuel because they had infinite resources. "We cannot defeat this with tactics," he admitted. But inside the cabs of those trucks, the reality was less civilized. It was a nightmare of exhaustion. The drivers were pushing their bodies beyond human limits. They popped benzodrine pills to stay awake. They drove for 72 hours straight. In the fog and the dust, hallucinations set in. Men saw phantom bridges that weren't there. They crashed into ditches. Over 300 drivers died in accidents, exhausted casualties of the supply war. But they kept driving. Most of them were African Americans. They knew what the Nazis thought of them. Hitler called them an inferior race.
Yet here they were, out-driving, outworking, and defeating the master race with every mile. Oberst Hans von Luck, a brilliant panzer commander captured in September, summed it up in the interrogation room. "We knew we had lost when we saw your trucks," von Luck told his captors. "You violate every rule of war. You waste fuel. You abandon vehicles. But you succeed through sheer volume. You have industrialized warfare beyond our comprehension."
The sound of that industry haunted the German trenches. All night long, they could hear the drone of the GNC CCKW engines. It was the sound of inevitable defeat. The weapon wasn't a tank. It was the GMC Jimmy. By the end of the war, General Motors had built 500,000 of them. The U.S. Army had more trucks than the entire German military combined. And these weren't simple machines. They had all-wheel drive. They ran on garbage fuel. They had heaters that actually worked in the winter. But the real difference was the philosophy. If a German engine died, a master mechanic would spend days rebuilding it by hand. It was craftsmanship. If an American engine died, a 19-year-old kid would rip it out with a crane, drop in a brand new one, and have the truck rolling in 45 minutes. The old engine was left in a ditch. It was the throwaway army.
And it moved faster than thought. As Patton raced east, the red ball wasn't enough, so the Americans mutated the system. Overnight, new colored markers appeared on the French trees. The White Ball Express from Rouen to Paris, the Green Diamond from Cherbourg, the Red Lion from Bayeux to Brussels, and the ABC Express into Belgium. German staff officers needed weeks to plan a supply line. The Americans did it in 48 hours.
They simply painted signs, assigned trucks, and drove. And watching all this were the German prisoners, forced to load the trucks. Their Nazi worldview was shattered. They saw African-American sergeants calculating complex weight distributions in their heads faster than German engineers. They saw inferior races performing miracles of organization. The black drivers knew the irony. They were fighting Hitler with truck keys. And every mile they drove was a hammer blow to the Aryan myth.
The Germans destroyed bridges to stop Patton. They calculated it would take 6 weeks to rebuild a major crossing. At Mons, the U.S. Army engineers arrived at a blown bridge. They didn't draw blueprints. They didn't hold meetings. They just started building. 14 hours later, the bridge was open. The German engineers were stunned. The Americans were building infrastructure faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy it.
While the Red Ball trucks were rolling, they built 40 bridges and 8 temporary cities just to house the drivers. But the real terror wasn't the bridges. It was what crossed them. The Red Ball Express didn't just bring food, it brought the steel rain. In September 1944, at the fortress city of Metz, the German defenders faced the US XX Corps. The German artillery commanders were rationing their shells. They were allowed to fire only 50 rounds per gun per day. They had to make every shot count. The Americans had no such limits. In a single 24-hour period, the American guns fired 100,000 rounds into Metz. They fired until the barrels glowed red. They fired just to keep the enemy awake. German officers couldn't comprehend it. To sustain that rate of fire required a supply chain of mathematical perfection. Yet the Red Ball Express delivered every single shell.
The artillery kept firing, but the trucks were dying. The Red Ball Express was an act of mechanical suicide. By late September, the statistics were horrific. A GMC truck was built to last 30,000 miles. On the Red Ball, they were dead in 10,000. The convoy system chewed up 10,000 tires a week. It burned out 500 engines a week. Over 5,000 vehicles were totally destroyed or abandoned in ditches.
In the German army, this would have been a catastrophe. In the U.S. Army, it was a spreadsheet entry. Liberty ships arrived in France every week, vomiting hundreds of brand new trucks onto the docks. The Germans realized with horror that the Americans were destroying more trucks per week than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in France, and their fleet was still growing. The French civilians watched this river of steel with awe. During the occupation, the Germans had taken everything. Now, the American drivers, exhausted, dusty, often African American, were tossing chocolate, soap, and cigarettes to the children. German intelligence noted the disaster. Resistance activity has increased 400%, a report stated. The population sees the convoys and believes American victory is inevitable. But the system was stretching to the breaking point. By September 8th, the round trip was 700 miles. Drivers were hallucinating. Trucks were falling apart.
General Hasso von Montefel, one of Germany's best panzer commanders, saw the signs. He reported, "American supply lines show signs of collapse. Convoy intervals are widening. This is our opportunity." The Germans thought the red ball was about to snap. The Germans were waiting for the collapse. Instead, they witnessed a mutation. The American response to the crisis was blistering. Within 72 hours, the entire Red Ball Express was reorganized. They cut the runs in half. They established transfer points. They doubled the number of trucks. By September 12th, instead of slowing down, the tonnage actually increased. But the Americans didn't stop at the road. They took the supply war to the sky. On September 16th, German observers looked up and saw the sun blocked out by wings. 900 C-47 Skytrain transports were landing at forward airfields. It was a humiliation for the Luftwaffe. At the siege of Stalingrad, the German Air Force had killed itself trying to deliver 300 tons a day. The Americans delivered 2,700 tons in a single afternoon. And they did it casually. They treated their expensive aircraft like flying trucks, landing in muddy fields, dumping cargo, and taking off again. What truly baffled the German High Command, however, was the leadership. In the Wehrmacht, a decision to move a division's supplies required a general. In the Red Ball Express, that decision was made by a sergeant. Junior American officers were commanding fleets of trucks larger than entire German regiments. To the Prussians, this lack of hierarchy looked like anarchy. But in the chaos of war, this anarchy was faster, smarter, and more lethal than German discipline. By October 1944, the Red Ball Express began to slow down. Not because it failed, but because the American railroad engineers had done the impossible. While the trucks were rolling, the engineers had rebuilt 1,000 miles of destroyed track behind them. The Red Ball was supposed to last 10 days. It lasted 82. In that time, it delivered 412,000 tons of supplies. It delivered 40,000 tons of artillery shells just to General Patton alone. When German officers reviewed these figures in captivity, they were stunned. They admitted their mistake. Before the invasion, their analysts had tried to predict American capacity. They took the best performance of the German army, multiplied it by 3, and assumed that was the American limit. They were wrong by a factor of 10. Field Marshal Walter Model, defending the German border, wrote a final report that stripped away all the excuses. We were not defeated by American tanks or planes, he admitted. We were defeated by American trucks. But the most haunting image wasn't on a spreadsheet. It was at the prisoner of war camps.
thousands of captured German soldiers stood at the barbed wire fences, staring at the highway. They stood in silence, counting the trucks, one every few seconds, endless, unstoppable. Some of the prisoners wept. They weren't crying because they were captives. They were crying because they finally understood the math. They realized that their defeat had been inevitable from the moment the first engine started.
The Red Ball Express didn't just break the German army. It broke the American army's own prejudices. The entire operation depended on African American soldiers. These men were segregated, treated as second-class citizens, and barred from combat units. Yet they were the heartbeat of the invasion. In September 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood by a dusty French road. He watched the black drivers roaring past, eyes red with fatigue, muscles straining at the wheel after 20 hours of driving.
His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, wrote down the general's words. "These men," Eisenhower said quietly, "are winning the war as surely as any infantry. We need to reconsider many things." On the other side of the line, the Nazis were having a different kind of crisis. The SS racial scientists had spent years writing that black men were inferior, incapable of technical mastery or organization. Now, faced with the undeniable reality of the Red Ball Express, they went silent.
The Nazi propaganda magazines simply stopped mentioning American logistics. The truth was too damaging to print. Years later, General Oberst Franz Halder, the former chief of the German General Staff, looked back at the ruin of his country and admitted the lesson they had learned too late. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics determines strategy, Halder wrote. The Americans understood this. We did not. The statistics were impressive, but the individual stories were unbelievable.
The Germans operated on strict orders. The Americans operated on guts. Take Corporal John L. Houston. He drove his truck for 48 hours straight without sleep to get ammunition to the 2nd Armored Division at Cambrai. He fell asleep at the wheel 3 times, drifted off the road, was slapped awake by his convoy mates, and kept driving. He refused to stop until the guns were fed. Then there was Private Booker T. Washington.
He was hauling medical supplies when his brakes overheated and caught fire. Regulations said, "Abandon the vehicle." Washington ignored the regulations. He realized his cargo could save lives. He drove the burning truck for 2 miles, flames licking at the cab windows, until he reached a field hospital. He jumped out seconds before the fire consumed the driver's seat. In late 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans tried to copy this.
Under Operation Greif, commandos led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny captured 50 American trucks. They tried to set up their own supply line using enemy equipment. It failed instantly. The German drivers couldn't handle the high speeds. The mechanics couldn't fix the engines without spare parts, and the fuel ran out in days. Skorzeny's report was a confession of inferiority. We captured 50 trucks. Within a week, 30 were dead. The Americans would have simply replaced them.
We tried to repair them. That difference is why we lost. Then came the winter. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest on record. The roads turned to sheets of black ice. The German manuals were clear. Wheeled transport is impossible in these conditions. The panzers stopped. The Wehrmacht froze. But the red ball kept rolling. The American drivers improvised. They wrapped heavy chains around their tires. When antifreeze ran out, they poured pure alcohol into the radiators to keep the engines from cracking. They slowed down to 15 miles per hour, crawling through blizzards that blinded them, but they never stopped delivering the tonnage. In May 1945, after the surrender, the Allies forced captured German generals to study the Red Ball Express. It crushed their pride. General der Infanterie Friedrich Schulz admitted defeat not just militarily, but philosophically. The Americans created a temporary civilization, Schulz wrote. We built permanent infrastructure over years. You created superior systems in days, used them, and then dissolved them. But the final word came from the master himself, General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, the man who invented modern tank warfare. We invented Blitzkrieg, Guderian said, but we never solved its limit, logistics. The Americans solved it through industrial excess. He looked at the maps of the Red Ball route and shook his head. It was not a supply line, he said. It was a flowing river of material that drowned us. The bill for the Red Ball Express was staggering. In 1944, it cost the United States $100 million. To the German mind, obsessed with thrift and scarcity, this was insanity. But the Americans did a colder calculation. Every day the war continued cost the U.S. Treasury $250 million. If the Red Ball shortened the war by even a single day, it paid for itself twice over. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, the master of logistics, put it ruthlessly. We wore out 5,000 trucks and 23,000 men to destroy the German army, Lee said. In any previous war, that would be a catastrophe. In American industrial war, it is acceptable overhead. While German officers were quoting Clausewitz and studying ancient maneuvers, the Americans were studying Detroit assembly lines. On September 15, 1944, the supreme German commander in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, stared at the reports. He realized the game was up. He summoned his staff and spoke the truth. Gentlemen, von Rundstedt said, we face something beyond a military solution. The Americans have made distance irrelevant. He explained that every army in history has a culminating point, the moment it runs out of steam and has to stop. That point does not exist for them, he concluded. They have revolutionized warfare, and we are fighting the last war. The German High Command was desperate. Oberst Hans Speidel, the operations officer, suggested a massive air campaign. He wanted the Luftwaffe to bomb the Red Ball Highway into oblivion.
Field Marshal von Rundstedt looked at him with pity. "With what?" von Rundstedt asked. "They have 6,000 trucks. If we destroy 1,000, which we cannot, they will replace them in a week. We would need to destroy 200 trucks every single day just to match their factory output. We don't even have 200 planes left." But the convoys were doing more than delivering supplies. They were breaking the German mind.
At night, in the foxholes, the German soldiers couldn't sleep. They could hear it, a low, constant drone in the distance, the sound of thousands of engines that never stopped. It became psychological warfare. The American Ghost Army units realized this terror. They set up massive loudspeakers on the front lines. On nights when the roads were empty, they blasted recordings of truck convoys toward the German trenches. The Germans reported these phantom convoys as real. They believed the Americans had infinite supplies, even when they didn't. The sound of a GMC engine became the sound of doom. By November 1944, the rail lines were finally fixed. The Red Ball Express was officially shut down. And then it did one last impossible thing. It vanished. In 72 hours, an organization of 23,000 men and 6,000 vehicles simply dissolved. The trucks were reassigned. The drivers became infantry or port workers. The makeshift cities disappeared.
The Germans would have taken months to dismantle such a beast. The Americans did it in a weekend. May 1945. The interrogation rooms were full of German generals. They were asked one question: why did you lose? General Hasso von Montefell, a man who had spent his life studying tank warfare, gave a simple answer. When we understood your logistics, Montefell said, we knew the war was lost. You could supply armies faster than we could destroy them.
The Red Ball Express was a weapon against which we had no defense. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the brilliant defender of Italy and the West, was even more blunt. When asked what surprised him most about the American army, he didn't say the atomic bomb. He didn't say the Mustang fighter. It was your trucks, Kesselring admitted. The Red Ball Express showed us that you had militarized your entire society. We realized we weren't fighting soldiers. We were fighting your factories. The final butcher's bill for the operation proved him right. In 82 days, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,000 tons of supplies. It burned 57 million gallons of fuel. It wore out 180,000 tires. It cost the United States $100 million. But the most important statistic was 180. Historians estimate the operation shortened the war in Europe by 180 days. That is 6 months of killing that didn't happen.
6 months of gas chambers that were shut down early. In 1994, 50 years later, the U.S. government finally issued a stamp to honor them. It was a late recognition of a fundamental truth.
Logistics is not support. Logistics is the main event. The Red Ball Express proved that a messy democracy could crush a rigid dictatorship. The German generals had bet on totalitarian efficiency. They lost to American excess.
They assumed the Allies would advance cautiously, conserving fuel. Instead, the Americans unleashed a logistical tsunami. 6,000 trucks, 12,000 tons a day, 700 miles of road. But the success wasn't just about machines. It was about the men. In the Wehrmacht, a soldier needed a field marshal's permission to change the plan. In the Red Ball Express, a corporal saw a blocked road, found a detour, and kept moving. Individual initiative defeated rigid hierarchy.
General George S. Patton, the most aggressive commander of the war, knew exactly who saved him. In his memoirs, Patton wrote the ultimate tribute to the men he relied on. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, Patton wrote, deserve as much credit for the defeat of Germany as any combat unit. He acknowledged the brutal truth. Without them, the Third Army doesn't move. Without movement, we don't win. Patton noted who these men were. They were black soldiers, mostly, segregated, discriminated against, denied recognition. But they won the war as surely as any rifleman. That is the verdict of history. 23,000 drivers achieved the impossible. They moved faster than physics should allow, and they proved that in the end, the side with the most trucks beats the side with the best tanks. In the end, the war wasn't won by the bravest soldiers. It was won by the fastest delivery.
The German generals who laughed in August 1944 were signing unconditional surrender documents in May 1945. They were defeated by 23,000 truck drivers who broke every rule of warfare at 35 miles per hour. The Red Ball Express wasn't elegant. It wasn't efficient, but it worked. It kept Patton rolling. It shortened the war by months, saving countless lives in the gas chambers and on the battlefields. The Germans learned the hardest lesson of the industrial age.
There is an old military saying, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. But in 1944, the Red Ball Express added a new line, Americans talk trucks. The final word belongs to a nameless German officer. He was captured in Belgium, standing by the side of the road. As he waited, he watched the endless, roaring convoy of American trucks passing him, one every 5 seconds, for hours. He turned to his American captor, his face pale with realization.
"We prepared for everything," the German said. "We prepared for your tanks, your planes, your ships, but we never prepared for your trucks." He shook his head. "How do you defeat an enemy who has more trucks than you have soldiers?" The answer rolled past him in a cloud of dust. The German generals stopped laughing. But by then, General Patton was already
at their gates.